This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Institute of Philosophy. My name is Colin Besson, and I'm the director of the Center for Logic and Language, which is hosting this conference. And on behalf of the Center, I'm delighted to welcome you here today at the Institute. So let me say a few words about the conference. Its title is the Second Logic and Language Conference, and the title is very apt, but it requires some qualifications. It is very apt because it is indeed the Second Logic and Language Conference as organized by the Institute of Philosophy and the Northern Institute of Philosophy in turn. So the first Logic and Language Conference took place over 2 years ago at the Northern Institute of Philosophy, and I really look forward to seeing many of you in Aberdeen in 2 years' time. But the title needs qualification because this sort of conference on logic and language has many ancestors. In some shape or other, it has been taking place in the UK in various universities for many years, and indeed for many decades. And although there have been periods when the conference has gone quiet, it has always been revived with great success. This is because there is a need for us to meet and to talk as part of our thriving community of philosophers of logic and language. So for one, I would like to thank Barry Smith and Christian Rice for doing the service, indeed for taking the initiative of setting up this new series of logic and language conferences. Witness to this great community are, of course, our speakers at this conference, the philosophers who will be chairing their talks, and very importantly, without whom not, the attendees to the conference. So thank you all for taking part in this. I wish you all a very enjoyable and productive conference.
Okay, so thanks very much. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Sarah Sawyer from the University of Sussex, who will be talking to us about judgment, motivation and reason. Thanks.
Okay, so this paper concerns 3 different debates. The first is a debate about the nature of representation in thought. You have a handout in your pack, actually, that follows the slides. The second is a debate over the connection between a subject's moral judgment and her motivation to act. And the third is a debate over the connection between a subject's reasons for action and his subjective motivation to set. Each of these debates is categorised as a debate between internalism about a particular subject matter and externalism about that subject matter. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they share a common structure. So each of the various internalisms prioritises the perspective of the individual in some way or other, whereas each of the various externalisms emphasises the importance of facts that may well lie outside the individual's perspective. The debates have largely received independent treatment. There are a few exceptions, perhaps on the grounds that the connection between the debates runs no deeper than the structural similarity stated. But I think the connection between the debates is more than merely structural. I take the first of these 3 debates, the debate over the nature of representation in thought, to be primary. This is, first, because the other 2 debates presuppose that there are representational states, so moral judgments that may or may not be internally connected to motivation, and sets of beliefs and desires that may or may not provide reasons for action. But the very possibility of representation in thought depends on an externalist understanding of representational states. And this takes us to the second and more fundamental reason for the primacy of the debate over the nature of representation. Once it's understood that representational content is essentially individuated with reference to relations between the subject and her environment, a resolution to the other 2 debates comes into view, I claim. An externalist understanding of representation in thought has the resources, I maintain, to overcome the apparent disagreements evident in the debates concerning moral judgment on one hand and reasons for action on the other. So the general aim of the paper is to elucidate the more than mere structural connection between the three debates, and in particular to show that representational externalism binds the debates inextricably together. The more specific aim of the paper is to elaborate a new moral theory, which is perhaps not what you were expecting today, which I'll call moral externalism. So this emerges from consideration of externalism about representational content. The structure of the paper is as follows. In section 1, I characterise an externalist theory of representational content. I won't offer direct arguments for the view here, since, aside from having argued for it elsewhere, the main purpose of the paper is to show how externalism about representational content impacts on the two debates in the moral area. The paper as a whole, however, constitutes an indirect argument for externalism about representational content on the grounds that it can explain away the apparent disagreement in the two debates in moral philosophy. In section 2, I'll set up the debate concerning the connection between moral judgment and motivation and show how an externalist theory of representation can resolve it. In section 3, I'll show how the resulting view of the connection between moral judgment and motivation can itself resolve the debate concerning the connection between a subject's reasons for action and her subjective motivational set, and then I'll conclude in section 4. So the paper sort of builds. The resolution to the first debate is then used to resolve the second. Okay, so section 1, representational content and thought. So this section provides an initial characterisation of externalism about representational content in thought and distinguishes it from externalism about representational content in language. I'm just going to start with a very simple example. So one thing I believe is that penguins can't fly. My capacity to believe this clearly depends on my having the concept penguin. If I didn't have the concept penguin, then I couldn't have any thoughts involving the concept penguin, which is to say, I couldn't have any thoughts about penguins as penguins. But what does my possession of the concept penguin depend on? According to externalism about representational content, relations between a thinker and her external environment play an essential role in determining her concepts. The fact that I have the concept penguin, for example, depends in part, but essentially, on the fact that I've been related in the right kind of way to penguins themselves. I've read about them, visited them in zoos, watched programmes about them, heard stories about them and so on. And if there had been no penguins around anywhere, then plausibly I couldn't have possessed the concept penguin. After all, how could I have acquired it? That simple line of thought doesn't apply to every possible concept. It's no doubt possible to possess a concept in the absence of entities to which that concept applies. This is consistent with an externalist understanding of the nature of representation. The externalist claim is simply that there could be no representation in thought without some relations to an environment. This line of thought is sometimes backed by the example of the chemist who possesses the concept water despite living in a world with no water. If her world contained hydrogen and oxygen and she possessed concepts of each of those elements, it's suggested, she could come to possess the concept water in virtue of theorising about hydrogen and oxygen combining in the appropriate way. The example appears originally in one of Burge's papers and it's been cited prolifically since, with almost universal assent, but I think the example is actually problematic. To my mind, such a theoriser might come to possess the concept H2O, which represents water, but couldn't come to possess the concept water. The example goes wrong in treating water as a reducible concept, which I think it's not. Water may be identical to H2O, but the concept water is not identical to the concept H2O. While compound concepts such as H2O can be possessed in the absence of their instances, irreducible concepts can't. So understood correctly, the example does provide support for the claim that a concept can be possessed by an individual who's had no contact with its instances, since the chemist in the example could come to possess the concept H2O, which is a natural kind concept, but one that lacks application in her world. Possession of a fundamental irreducible concept, in contrast, depends essentially on causal relations to its instances. I have a certain view about what counts as fundamental and what counts as a natural kind, according to which the concept penguin is actually a fundamental concept, but you don't need to agree with that by any means. Okay, so the externalist thinks of concepts as public rather than private. You and I may both have the concept penguin and may both believe that penguins can't fly, but we may nonetheless have somewhat different understandings of what penguins are. That is, different beliefs about whether they all live in cold climates, what they eat, how many varieties there are, whether the different varieties can interbreed, whether they're all basically black and white, and so on. But despite these differences, according to the externalist understanding of concepts as public, it's still penguins that we're thinking about, and this in part because of our causal connections to penguins. It's clear that people have slightly different surrounding beliefs about most things most of the time, but that doesn't prevent us from thinking about the same things. Externalism about representational content explains how this is possible. According to the externalist, grasp of a concept comes in degrees, and the extent to which one grasps a concept varies with one's knowledge of the nature of the things that fall under the concept. The more one knows about penguins, the better one grasps the concept penguin. This conception of concepts has normative implications. According to the externalist, the way in which one ought to apply a concept has to be responsive to the nature of the things the concept represents, to the nature of penguins, for instance. These conceptual norms are universal. They govern how one ought to apply a given concept, irrespective of how good a grasp of the concept one has. This means that it cannot ultimately be deference to experts that determines how one ought to apply a concept. Consulting an expert can help to improve one's knowledge only insofar as the expert is genuinely knowledgeable about the subject matter. And hence consulting an expert can help one grasp the concept more fully only insofar as the expert's grasp of the concept is better than one's own. But crucially, the experts too may get things wrong, sometimes significantly wrong. It's not the experts that determine how one ought to apply concepts, then, but the way the world is. Okay, so this brief characterisation highlights three main aspects of the externalist theory that I just wanted to bear in mind as we go through to the other debates. So first, what an individual represents in thought depends in part, but essentially, on the relation she bears to her environment. Second, an individual can think with a concept that she grasps incompletely. And third, thought is governed by norms that do not derive from the subjective resources, abilities, capacities, and so on of the individual thinker. The norms of thought derive in part from the nature of the world beyond the individual. Okay, so now on to section 2, moral judgment and motivation. With this brief characterisation of externalism about representational content in hand, I now turn to the second internalism externalism debate, which concerns the connection between moral judgment and motivation. Moral judgments are ones that involve moral concepts. I take that as definition. So moral concepts such as right, wrong, good and bad, the so-called thin moral concepts, and ones that involve moral concepts such as fairness, kindness, spite, discretion, blame, guilt, enterprise, industry, assiduity, treachery, promise, offence, brutality, malice, courage, deceit, gratitude, exploitation, and so on, the so-called thick moral concepts. Moral judgments, that is, judgments involving such concepts, appear to be motivating. So it's clear that in many cases at least, once we make a sincere moral judgment to the effect that a certain course of action is right or wrong, we're motivated, at least to some extent, to act accordingly. For example, having judged that it's right to recycle cardboard rather than throwing it away, I was motivated to take my cardboard to the recycling centre rather than leaving it out in the rubbish. And having judged that it's wrong to eat meat, I was motivated to stop eating meat. Similarly, having promised to call a friend, I was motivated to do so, and having judged that I'd unwittingly caused offence, I was motivated to apologise. There's something peculiar about a person who claims to make these kinds of moral judgments and yet shows no inclination whatsoever to act in accordance with them. Indeed, we're likely to regard the proclamations of such a person as insincere. That there is a connection between moral judgment and motivation is generally agreed. It's the nature of the connection that's disputed. According to the motivational judgment internalist, the connection between moral judgment and motivation is an internal or conceptual one. That is, it's a conceptual truth that moral judgments motivate. According to strong motivational judgment internalism, necessarily, if an individual makes a sincere moral judgment, then she will be overridingly motivated to act in accordance with it. That's clearly too strong. According to weak motivational judgment internalism, on the face of it, a far more plausible view, necessarily, if an individual makes a sincere moral judgment, then she will be motivated to some extent to act in accordance with it. This allows that the motivation may be outweighed by conflicting motivations and defeated by mental maladies such as depression, extreme exhaustion, and so on. So in those cases, the motivation can be defeated. Motivational judgment externalism is simply the denial of motivational judgment internalism. As such, the connection between moral judgment and motivation is taken to be external in the sense that whether or not one is motivated depends on factors external to the moral judgment itself. So, for example, the connection might be taken to depend on contingent facts about one's desires, human psychology more generally, or even the nature of rationality, but facts that lie outside the moral judgment itself. The difference between internalism and externalism in this particular debate emerges most graphically in consideration of a character called the amoralist. The amoralist is someone who, we are told, is able to use moral terms to classify actions, character traits, states of affairs, and so on, just as other people do, but is not motivated in the least to act appropriately. The amoralist might judge that it's right to recycle, but nonetheless lack any motivation to do so. And the amoralist might judge that it's wrong to eat meat, but nonetheless lack any motivation to stop doing so. Motivational externalists maintain that the amoralist is possible. They maintain that there is no conceptual incoherence in making a moral judgment and failing to be motivated to act in accordance with it. This is because the connection between moral judgment and motivation is an external, i.e. non-conceptual one. The amoralist might, for instance, simply lack the desires that in most of us serve to connect our moral judgments and our motivations. Motivational internalists, in contrast, reject the very coherence of the amoralist, since, according to motivational judgment internalists, the connection between moral judgment and motivation is an internal conceptual one. As such, they are forced to re-describe the apparent examples of the amoralist as ones that either involve some low-level or masked motivation, despite appearances to the contrary, or do not really involve moral judgments, again, despite appearances to the contrary. So on this latter front, the strategy of maintaining that in cases where it looks as if someone has made a moral judgment and there is no motivation at all to act in accordance with it, what the motivational internalist will do is say, for instance, that the amoralist doesn't judge that it's right to recycle cardboard. She judges that recycling cardboard is what other people call, quotes, right. And this, of course, is not a moral judgment, since it involves the application of no moral concepts. Okay. The nature of the connection between moral judgment and motivation, on the one hand, and the coherence or incoherence of the amoralist on the other, appear to be two sides of the same coin. However, I want to suggest that there's no inconsistency in maintaining both that the connection between moral judgment and motivation is conceptual, as the internalist does, and that the amoralist is conceptually coherent, as the externalist does. Now, how can that be? Is my question. An externalist account of representational content provides the answer, I think, as follows. So, moral judgments involve moral concepts. Moral concepts, just like non-moral concepts, are representational and hence externally individuated. As such, individual thinkers can think with a moral concept that they grasp only incompletely. Even if a subject who grasped the moral concept fully would be motivated to act in accordance with the judgments involving that moral concept, since it's possible to make a moral judgment involving a concept that one does not fully grasp, it's possible to make a moral judgment but fail to be motivated. So this is illustrated by the example of Alice. This is taken from a paper by Greenberg. So consider Alice. Alice is a moral and political philosopher with a strong libertarian streak. She develops an elaborate moral theory according to which liberty is the fundamental value, and equality is not a value at all. In working out the consequences of the theory, she forms the hypothesis that considerations of fairness are really considerations of equality in another guise. She finds some arguments that support the hypothesis, and eventually she comes to question whether fairness is a moral virtue, indeed whether it's a reason for action of any kind. Accordingly, she loses the belief that fairness is a reason for action. Alice believes that it's important to bring one's motivations and actions into line with one's beliefs, and she's good at accomplishing this. Because of her doubt about whether fairness is a reason for action, she apparently loses any disposition to be motivated to perform fair actions qua fair. She might perform them under another way of presentation, as it were, but not qua fair. She also apparently loses any disposition to feel resentment or indignation at unfairness. So I'm assuming here that the concept fair is in fact a moral concept. If you don't like the example, you can change it, but I'm assuming that that's a moral concept. And this is a case of someone who possesses the moral concept, but fails to be motivated in accordance with judgments involving it. After the change in her theoretical views, Alice continues to make generally accurate judgments about whether particular actions, procedures, and so on are fair. That is, she continues to make moral judgments involving the concept fair, but she's no longer motivated appropriately by the judgments because, subsequent to the development of the new theory, she ceases to recognise their moral force. So it looks here then as if we have a case of moral judgment without motivation. And this precisely because we have a subject who grasps a moral concept incompletely. So what might the motivational internalist say in response? So the case of Alice, the case where we have an individual who possesses a moral concept incompletely, makes moral judgments involving that concept, but fails to be motivated by them, precisely because she has an incomplete grasp of the concepts involved, is the case that on the face of it, the internalist will want to reject. Because, on the face of it, it's a case where you have a moral judgment, but you lack motivation. And that's what the internalist denies as a conceptual possibility. So what might the internalist say in response? Well, there are 4 prima facie internalist responses that I could think of. First, the internalist might say that subsequent to the development of her new theory, Alice just lacks the concept of fairness. That, I think, is just straightforwardly implausible. Alice has consistent views about which procedures and rules are fair, both before and after she develops her moral theory, and her views are standard. Indeed, Alice is most naturally described as having developed a theory precisely about, amongst other things, fairness. Alice simply no longer thinks that fairness is a moral virtue. So that response, I don't think, works. The second response runs along these lines. The motivational internalist might say that while it looks as if Alice's judgments about fairness are the same both before and after the development of her theory, in fact, what look to be judgments of fairness after the development of her theory are in fact judgments merely about what other people call fair. But that too, I think, is implausible. Alice hasn't changed her mind about the nature of fairness as such. She's changed her mind about whether or not fairness has any moral worth. So that doesn't work either, I think. Third, the motivational internalist might say that Alice retains her motivation to act in accordance with the judgments about fairness, but that some interfering factor is, after the development of the theory, preventing her motivation from manifesting itself. But what could this interfering factor be? Alice is not suffering from any of the standard maladies associated with interfering factors such as depression or extreme exhaustion, for instance. Her lack of motivation is, rather, best explained by her false theoretical beliefs. But having false theoretical beliefs cannot plausibly be taken to constitute an interfering factor analogous to suffering from depression or extreme exhaustion. It's implausible then to think that Alice retains her motivation. Finally, the motivation internalist might say that Alice's judgments about fairness and unfairness cease to be moral judgments after she develops her moral theory. But that response, I think, is also inadequate, since fairness is a moral virtue. That's what we're assuming. And this entails that judgments involving the concept fair are moral judgments, regardless of who makes them, and hence regardless of whether the subject, like Alice, fails to see that they are. A concept status as a moral concept does not shift from one occasion of use to another in accordance with the variable beliefs of the thinkers who deploy it. That Alice's judgments should be regarded as moral judgments is backed by consideration of the internalist claim that moral consideration is internally connected to motivation. Put in terms of moral consideration, rather than moral judgment, the internalist claim is actually ambiguous as between C1, a subject who recognises a moral consideration is thereby motivated, and C2, a subject who deploys a moral concept is thereby motivated. My interpretation of the example of Alice assumes that the correct way to understand the internalist claim is as C2, namely, a subject who deploys a moral concept is thereby motivated. And I think that has to be right. Is deployment of moral concepts, whether or not one recognises them as moral concepts, that is essentially connected to motivation. To see this, consider the alternative. The alternative says that a subject who recognises a moral consideration is thereby motivated. But that is in fact itself ambiguous, having a strong or weak reading. So the strong reading is a reading according to which a subject who recognises a moral consideration, for example, recognises that fairness is a moral consideration, is thereby motivated. But that strong reading is simply too strong to be plausible. It would require that subjects possess a conceptual understanding of morality that's beyond that which is required of those making moral judgments. Second, recognising that fairness is a moral consideration is recognition without an application to a particular state of affairs. And therefore it can have no direct implications for motivation. So the weak reading of C1, on the other hand, is a reading according to which a subject who recognises a moral consideration, for example, that a certain action is unfair, or that a certain procedure is unfair, is thereby motivated. And that's just equivalent to the claim that a subject who deploys a moral concept is thereby motivated. So that's the way I think we have to read it. Alice is similar in spirit to what Brink has called a principled amoralist. He writes, quote, "Because moral motivation is predicated on the assumption that moral requirements generate reasons for action or have rational authority, it is possible to make moral judgments and yet remain unmoved as long as there are possible conceptions of morality and practical reason according to which moral requirements need not have rational authority, need not be motivated." This he contrasts with an unprincipled amoralist who fails to be motivated because of interfering psychological factors, again, such as depression or extreme exhaustion. Alice, however, is a different kind of principled amoralist than the one Brink conceives. Alice is a principled amoralist, not because she comes to question the rational authority of moral judgments. She takes moral judgments to be, to require you to act. We can stipulate that she consistently takes moral judgments to be authoritative. Rather, she's a principled amoralist because she believes of some of her moral judgments that they are not moral judgments. And that comes from her theory. Okay, so the example shows, I think, that a good-willed person can make a moral judgment that a particular state of affairs is unfair, say, and yet fail to be motivated to act accordingly. The lack of motivation is to be explained by the incomplete grasp of the moral concept involved in the moral judgment. It's because Alice has a false moral theory and hence an incomplete grasp of the relevant concept that she fails to be motivated by her moral judgments about fairness. In this way, the possibility of the amoralist can be seen to be consistent with there being a conceptual connection between moral judgments and motivation. So we might state the conceptual connection as follows. So this is externalist, motivational, internalist. Necessarily, if an individual makes a sincere moral judgment and she has a full grasp of the concepts involved in that moral judgment, then she will be motivated to some extent to act in accordance with it. EMI, externalist motivation and internalism, draws essentially on externalism about representational content to maintain an internal connection between moral judgment and motivation consistent with the possibility of the amoralist. So that's how the divide between the externalist and the internalist is overcome. Okay. So, now to section 3 concerning moral reasons and motivation. The question at issue between the reasons internalist and the reasons externalist is the question of whether a subject's normative reasons for action necessarily derive from her subjective motivational set, from facts about what she is or can be motivated to do, from motivational attitudes that she either has or would have under certain idealised conditions. The reasons internalist maintains that a subject's normative reasons for action do indeed necessarily derive from her subjective motivational set, her desires, for instance. The reasons externalist, in contrast, maintains that a subject's normative reasons exist independently of her individual motives. The reasons are external to her, they're out there and they're objective. Both positions, I think, have some intuitive appeal. The internalist position is supported by the natural thought that reasons for action must be capable of moving an agent to act, that there is a kind of incoherence in the notion of a reason for action that cannot motivate. This position is often linked to the Humean theory of motivation, according to which desires are essential for action. The externalist position, in contrast, is supported by the natural thought that recognition of a reason to act is recognition of a consideration in favour of acting. That is, recognition of some objective value that exists independently of one's motives. Thus, it might be thought that a child has a reason to own up to breaking the vase, a reason not to cheat at snakes and ladders, a reason to hand in the toys she found in the playground, a reason to share her sweets, and so on, even if she has no desire at all to do any of them, and is not in the least bit motivated to do so. After all, one might think, owning up, playing fairly, handing in lost property and sharing are all, at least in certain circumstances, the right things to do. And this provides, in those circumstances, a normative reason to do them. Despite the fact that both positions have some intuitive appeal, prima facie one must choose between them. Between reasons that are essentially motivational because subjective, and reasons that are essentially divorced from motivation because objective. Thus, we're faced with a theoretically unsatisfactory dilemma. Internalism, reasons internalism, provides a relatively straightforward answer to the question of how morality can be authoritative and action guiding, because an agent's moral reasons, like her normative reasons generally, derive from her motivational states. But as a consequence, internalism has difficulty in accounting for the apparent objectivity of moral reasons, since internalism seems to imply that what one ought to do depends essentially on what one wants to do, rather than on independent objective moral reasons. In contrast, externalism is consistent with the objectivity of moral reasons, since reasons are assumed not to derive from subjective motivational sets of individual subjects, but, as a result, reasons externalism faces the question of how morality can be action guiding, since objective moral reasons may be ones which are entirely disconnected from an individual's subjective motivational set, and hence ones which could play no role in guiding her actions. I want to suggest a resolution to the debate by drawing on the thesis of externalist motivational internalism, which is where we arrived at the end of section 2. And externalist motivational internalism, EMI, which is what we had at the end of section 2, relies, as I said, essentially on externalism about representational content. So EMI, which is at the end of section 2, opens up the possibility that a subject's normative reasons for action may be necessarily connected to her subjective motivational set, even though not derived from a subjective motivational set. Consequently, it opens up the possibility that moral reasons may be both objective and essentially action guiding. On this view, we could agree with the reasons in externalist that normative reasons for action do not derive from an individual's subjective motivational set, maintaining rather that normative reasons for action derive from the way the world is, from the very nature of morality. And we could also agree with the reasons internalist that reasons must be essentially capable of motivating. So here is, as a reminder, what we had at the end of section 2. This is externalist, motivational, internalism. Necessarily, if an individual makes a sincere moral judgment and she has a full grasp of the concepts involved in that moral judgment, then she will be motivated to some extent to act in accordance with it. So that's what we had. And here's how the reconciliation concerning the nature of reasons can be derived from EMI. So according to EMI, a subject who possessed a full grasp of the moral concepts would be motivated to act in accordance with her sincere moral judgments. But, given externalism about representational content, a subject who possessed a full grasp of the moral concepts would necessarily have a full understanding of the nature of morality. Precisely because possession of a concept and understanding stuff that the concept represents go hand in hand. Consequently, the moral judgments of such a subject would of necessity be correct moral judgments, because they'd be informed by full understanding of the nature of morality. But correct moral judgments just are judgments, the content of which state objective reasons for acting. As such, objective reasons would be motivating for such a subject precisely because objective reasons would provide the content of her moral judgments, which are, according to EMI, essentially motivating and action guiding. Moreover, the fact that objective reasons would provide the content of the moral judgments of someone who possessed a full grasp of the moral concepts, and that hence they would be action guiding for such a subject, is not accidental. Rather, she would make those judgments precisely because they state moral truths, and hence provide objective moral reasons to act. Moral reasons on this picture are external to the subject in the sense that they do not derive from her subjective motivational set. They're reasons for her no matter what her motivations are. But they're internal to her in the sense that were she to possess a full grasp of the moral concepts, the reasons would feature in her motivational set as the content of her moral judgments. So the necessary connection between a moral reason and an individual's subjective motivational set then is given as follows. So this is externalist reasons, internalism. Necessarily, if an individual makes a sincere moral judgment and she has a full grasp of the concepts involved in that moral judgment, then the content of her moral judgment will state an external, objective, normative reason to act. Okay. ERI, like EMI, relies essentially on externalism about representational content. The resulting view provides a necessary connection between external reasons and an individual's subjective motivational set. Clearly, we do not in general have a full grasp of all, or even any, moral concepts. However, since grasping a concept is a matter of degree and goes hand in hand with one's understanding of the subject matter in question, one's subjective motivational set will be related to genuine normative reasons for action to the extent that one grasps moral concepts, and hence to the extent that one understands the nature of morality, which is to say, the extent to which one has moral knowledge. On this view, a subject who fails to be motivated by moral reasons is not irrational, but simply lacking in moral knowledge. Okay. The conjunction of EMI and DRI, with their essential reliance on externalism about representational content, forms a distinctive moral view that I'm calling moral externalism. Moral externalism is a form of moral cognitivism, since it's committed to the claim that moral judgments are truth evaluable. It embodies a rejection of the Humean theory of motivation, since it's committed to the claim that moral judgments, beliefs, can motivate in the absence of desires. And it embodies a robust form of moral realism, since it presupposes that moral concepts refer to objective moral properties. Traditionally, motivational judgment internalism and reasons internalism have each been used to argue against moral realism. But if I'm right, there's a way to preserve the necessary connection between moral judgment and motivation on the one hand, and and reasons and subjective motivational sets on the other, consistent with moral realism. Despite the fact that moral externalism embodies a robust form of moral realism, it would be a mistake to think that moral externalism is committed to the codifiability of moral principles. Moral externalism is committed neither to the claim that there are exceptionless general moral principles, nor to the claim that there's a systematic procedure for determining, in a given context, the correct answer to a moral question. Correct moral judgments may well be, indeed I think they are, essentially uncodifiable in this sense. Moral externalism isn't even committed to the claim that there's always a determinate answer one way or another on every moral question. The kind of moral realism to which moral externalism is committed allows for a certain amount of vagueness in morality. All that's required is that when there is a determinate answer to a moral question, the answer is determinate independently of the beliefs and motives of the subject. Okay, so conclusion. So the paper's been primarily concerned with the implications of externalism about representational content for the nature of moral judgments and the nature of moral reasons. The resulting view, moral externalism, I claim, provides a way in which moral judgments can be internally connected to motivation, even though it's possible to fail to be motivated by one's sincere moral judgments. And it provides a way in which moral reasons can be essentially action guiding, even though objective. The view is at root externalist, but goes some way towards incorporating underlying internalist intuitions. The view is also part of a broader view according to which norms of thought and action are objective in being determined by the world beyond the individual, but do not as a result lie essentially beyond her grasp.
So questions?
So I'd like to ask about how do we, maybe of a clarification question about what concepts really are. So I was thinking about the kind of, well, what we would probably think are concepts, like the concept of a witch or other supernatural things that don't reliably have a causal connection with anything in the world. So are these just like apparent concepts, or what are they?
At present, I have conflicting views, actually. So I think, in different papers, I work at different ideas, and then I sort of realised afterwards that they don't really fit together. So I think there are clearly some concepts which you can possess in the absence of entities to which they apply because they're compositional. So maybe this isn't a good example, we can disagree about the examples, but maybe the concept of a witch is a compositional concept of a woman who performs such and such, so you can give a sort of descriptive account of it. It's not clear to me that's right, actually, but there must be some concepts, I think, which are compositional in that sense. I also think, though, that there are some concepts, and I think these occur in fiction particularly, which cannot be given that treatment, and it's essential to the nature of the fiction that they not be given that concept. And so there are some terms that I think we have to regard as empty. Interestingly, in the literature on fictional terms, it's proper names that people have focused on. And what I want to say is actually you can't give a proper account of fictional names along most people's lines without looking at the question of how to treat fictional predicates. And so I think those fictional predicates are actually empty. So there isn't really a concept.
Yeah, because it seems the worry is like that basically the notion of a concept that you have ends up being so externalist that you can't use it to do the sort of traditional roles of concept to explain people's actions or how people think of a certain proposition, for example, because in the end you will have to come up with a different level of explanation for that. So you have to have some kind of internal subjective representation nevertheless, which then explains how can people think about certain concepts or certain apparent concepts like mutual.
I actually don't think that's right. I think you can give a kind of externalist understanding of explanation and cause and reason and so on that fits quite nicely into the externalist view. So I think the assumption that there's something that you need to do that can't be done by this externalist account of concepts is itself an internalist prejudice.
Yeah, I agree that externalist motivational internalism is a possible position. I see how it goes. It's very interesting. But I was wondering if you could say more. What are the reasons to prefer it to strict externalism about motivation? So the strict externalists think that there is an amoralist who fully grasps the concept of fairness, and she may think, for instance, that she ought to be fair, but she doesn't feel motivated to be fair. And then the externalist says this is an irrational person, maybe, but not an impossible person. So what are your reasons to think that this view is wrong? It's actually impossible to fully grasp the concept of fairness.
That's right. So the dialectic of the paper is presenting as a possible option a view which accommodates some internalist intuitions and some externalist intuitions. And I think in that sense it has a virtue. But you're right that I haven't directly argued against the externalist position or the internalist position for that matter in either of the two debates. That I've left in.
Would it be possible to return to the slide on EMI?
It might be.
I'm a little concerned, so this is a conditional row, and I'm a little concerned it might be vacuously true.
Okay.
So I take it that how well we grasp the concept depends on how much we know about the concept in question. So to fully grasp it, we'd have to know everything about fairness. But no finite being ever knows everything about fairness. So no one ever fully grasps the concept, and then of course the antecedent comes out false and the whole thing comes out true.
I would have to think of it in terms of counterfactuals instead of straightforward conditional. I might need to revise it. But
think about ordinary people, like us. Presumably we want it to apply to us in the actual world.
Yes.
And so we want it sometimes there to be a connection between our grasp of moral concepts and our motivation. But this principle doesn't tell us anything about that because none of us fully grasp the concepts.
Yes, okay, good. That's right. So what I would need to do is spell out in more detail conditions under which there would be a connection even when a subject had a less than full grasp of the concept.
Okay. So it might be the case. So you would say something stronger than this.
Yeah.
Namely that when we've got a partial grasp of concepts, there's still some internal conceptual connection between that and motivation.
Yes.
But then what about Alice?
No, so what I would say is that it's not going to be as simple as just if you've got a partial grasp, you have a partial motivation, and the motivation increases the better the grasp you have. It's not going to be like that. So Alice is a case where there's a partial grasp but there's no motivation, and so there's no easy way of spelling out what the connection will be. So it will just have to be a much more complex explanation for what the connection consists in. But I think it's neither that you need a full grasp of the concept to be motivated, nor that a partial grasp will always suffice. I think there are cases that will go both ways. So yeah, it just gets messy, and I think that's okay.
I guess. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is about the incomplete grasp.
Yeah.
So in the case of concepts like water or concepts like arthritis, basically there are two traditional routes that allow us to say that subjects have incomplete grasp of a concept. And in both cases, the idea is that there is something out there that somehow fixes the extension of the concept, right? So in some cases, there are causal interactions with the environment, and by being in these causal interactions, the subject is able to use the concept even though she doesn't have any kind of theoretical grasp. In another case, there is this kind of practice of deferring to experts that are clearly recognized within the society, right? But the work and just the fact that one of these two mechanisms, if not both, are in place, is what allows us to say, well, in this case, there's an incomplete grasp of the concept. Now, I worry though that it's not clear at all that in the moral case, any of these two mechanisms are present. So the causal route, is obviously problematic, and with regard to the expert route, it's not clear to me that we do have in our society a clear mechanism of deference to a recognized set of experts, right? So I worry that some people might just want to resist this idea that there is incomplete grasp of a concept. I mean, for example, this is just an example, but an immediate rejoinder might be from the external side, maybe. No, it's not that I have an incomplete grasp of these concepts, it's just that I have different concepts. And there's nothing that fixes that my concept should also encompass what you want to be that. So could you say something about this?
Yeah, thanks. The expert route, I think, is derivative. So I mentioned that very briefly at the beginning. I don't think that really gets it in any case. So it's derivative on a causal route, I think, because it's knowledge that really is what's needed. The causal route, you said, is obviously implausible. I think that's okay, but that is actually something that I believe. I think there are moral properties out there, and I think they're causally connected to you. Obviously, I need to say more than just that. There's obviously complicated arguments to show that can't be true, but I tend to think of moral properties rather as along the lines of natural kinds properties.
I see. I thought you were okay. So, but the worry is that so it's not just that we have to be somehow connected to moral properties, but it has to be part of our concept that somehow we are answerable in our causal transaction. So our causal transaction is what grounds our possession of the concept. So it's a pretty strong claim that you're making there. It's not just that we interact causally with moral properties, but it's also that it's something that our moral concepts are something like natural kinds concepts, such that somehow we reach out there for these moral properties.
Yes, so the causal contact with moral properties is what grounds your possession of the concepts involved. Whether or not you want to say that's natural kind, I use natural kind quite loosely, so it doesn't really matter, but the causal contact will ground.
Yeah, so I have a question on behalf of the internalist. So you start out by presenting internalism as a claim that the motivation, moral internalism, your motivation has to be internal to our perspective. And then, of course, one way of fleshing out that, if you're internalist about concepts, is to say that it's internal to concepts. Now, then you go on to show that, there's actually a sense in which we can make it internal to concepts while not being, in the internalist sense, internal to the perspective. But there's a wonder that is just shows that, if you're internalist about motivation, then you want to explicate this in terms of internalism about concepts, then you can't be a concept externalist. There's a question whether you conserved anything of what really drove the internalist in the first place, which was internalism to perspective. Accounting for that in terms of internalism within conceptual content, that was just a way of explicating what really motivated internalism, which was internalism to perspective, right? But that's been lost in your picture.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat that.
Yeah, okay, so maybe I'm hazy, but so the initial idea was there's something about our perspective, the perspective and moral judge you have on the world, and within that perspective, he has to be motivated once he makes a moral judgment.
Right, okay.
One way of fleshing that out is that it's simply part of a moral concept that it motivates. But that seems to be an explication of the initial internalist idea. That's just one way of fleshing out the idea that judgment always has to be followed by some kind of internal motivation.
Right.
Then you go on to say that this way of explicating it, that motivation is the internal conceptual content, well, that part of explicating is compatible with some kind of externalism about concepts, which will then, enable us to remove the initial claim of the internalist, which is that essentially internal to perspective in all cases, right?
I think I might be missing the point. So I don't yet see why the initial motivation that the judgment is internal to the perspective, and then the motivation will follow, as it were. So I don't see why I can't preserve that. I'm not quite getting why that involves an internalism of that concept.
Well, you might think that, well, you've given an example which says that, you can make a moral judgment without having any form of motivation internal to your perspective, right? That's your very conclusion, right? That if you have a partial grasp, then you can actually make a moral judgment and you have no motivation internal to your perspective.
What do you mean by internal to your perspective? The motivation is not internal to your perspective, so you're not motivated. Is that what it means? Okay. Yeah, that's okay.
But that was very internalism.
Okay. So this is why, at the end, I say it's actually an externalist theory at root, but it goes some way towards accommodating internalist intuitions. So, of course, if you have a middle position, it's not going to accommodate everyone's intuitions on both sides, and you couldn't have that. But I think it goes some way to showing that you can have an internal connection of a kind, still with the amorous as possible.
Thank you. So, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about Brink's amorous. So, as I understand it, that case is slightly different from your Alice case.
Yeah.
Because Alice just comes to believe that fairness isn't an issue of morality.
Yes.
Whereas, as I understand, Brink's amorous sort of kind of like becomes disillusioned with the dictates of morality and just ceases to, I don't know, believe in its authority or be aware of it or whatever.
Yeah.
But it seems, certainly, as I understand it, Brink would think that the amorous still has a complete grasp. And so I'm guessing that you're going to say it's not possible, but I was just kind of wondering if you could say a little bit more.
Well, the Brink's amorous is not possible.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you would say about Brink's amorous.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I have not thought about that before. Off the top of my head, it seems right that I might have to deny that possibility, but I'll think about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. When you introduced the notion of a concept, in the first part of the talk you motivated the idea we can have a partial grasp of a concept using the idea of a penguin.
Yeah.
And that fits very well because when we think of varying degrees of general knowledge
Yeah.
about penguins.
Yeah.
But when you very first of all introduced concepts, you had a slightly different notion, that is the requirement for thought as such about a penguin.
Yes.
Now that looks to be a different role which I'm not sure general knowledge would be fit for.
Okay.
You might think that general knowledge about penguins presupposes the ability to think about penguins. Penguins are already there in the frame, and general knowledge is something else. I think my feeling is there's a tension there.
Okay, so I think that de re thought is more fundamental than de dicto thought, and that you initially are related to things by context and have in mind incomplete propositions. And then you get to apply concept to the things that you're related to in a non-conceptual way, and you sort of then get to have the de dicto thoughts. And so I think de re thought is fundamental for knowledge, and it's also fundamental for in terms of belief. And so that allows me, I think, to answer your kind of worry.
Maybe. I think there are issues there.
Yeah.
You have, I mean, your position about externalism of these concepts involves some sort of idea of coordination. You'll have these partial grasping and these partial grasping sort of coordinated in some way. Now, with externalism about physical properties, you can tell a story about that, which is all to do with natural kinds and global chains and division of efficacy and labour. There seems to be a question still open about, your story about moral concepts, what takes the place of that property. You can't play it exactly the same. One fairly clear candidate is the sort of stuff Hume does in books 2 and 3 of the Creeds, where there are external moral facts, and they are basically facts about social network and facts about the human passions, what happens to the human passions when they are deployed in social networks and the calm passions of desire for one's reputation and so on. Now this may not be the sort of position you had in mind, but it certainly seems to be, given what you've said, a possible position. And what I think it would show is that this sort of world of externalist explanation is in fact really quite large. And that one possibly, one possibly needs to do a bit of further taxonomy about exactly what sort of external position you are sketching out.
Yes, thank you. I do in fact think, an argument which is just a statement of it, but I do in fact think there are moral properties, there are moral facts, and I don't think they're determined by social networks. Actually, I think they're so I want a more robust realism than that. And I am inclined to think that the kind of story we tell about physical properties, you can also tell about biological properties, chemical properties, sociological properties, economic properties, psychological properties, and I think they're not physical, I think they're different. So I've got sort of pluralism of properties, and I think moral properties is just another kind of property. So I'm inclined to tell the same kind of story across the board.
I was interested in the case of the amoralist you were considering, and I was wondering whether this amoralist could be said to have the concept, the concept of fairness. If the motivational part of the concept is tied to the evaluative aspect, and this person has rejected this evaluative aspect of the concept, and the question is whether the person shares the concept anymore. That's one point. And another point is you want to defend externalist, moral realist position that goes together with this representationalist idea. Wouldn't you have to say that the person, in order to have the concept, must have some kind of relation with both, with the evaluative and the non-evaluative, the descriptive part of the concept? In order to have it, is there something like a minimal, even if someone can have a concept and have the whole information about what opinion is, but there might be minimal requirements to have the concept. And in the case of moral concepts, the question is if the minimal requirements don't include the evaluative aspect in order to have it.
Okay, thanks. I am inclined to think that you can't, that there's no particular specification of the minimal requirements to possess a concept. So I think concepts are things that you can come at from lots of different directions. I'm thinking it may be I don't really like the idea of thinking of moral concepts as having an evaluative aspect and a non-evaluative aspect. I don't think you can separate them in that way. But, of course, I do think you can get people who, like Alice, possess the
How is
concept
that
but
possible
don't
you
have
cannot
them.
separate?
Well, not entirely, I think. It depends. If by the evaluative aspect you mean the bit that motivates, then clearly it's possible to take that out. But it's not clear to me that's the only, I mean, if you just think of evaluative as a term more generally, it's not clear to me that's the only evaluative aspect of it. So, do you know what I mean? So I just think it's a bit messier than that neat division. But I don't, and in that sense, I don't think the person would have to have a relation to the evaluative aspect and a relation to the non-evaluative aspect in order to possess the concept, because I don't think them as clearly divided in that way.
So this is maybe a particular point about something that might have got wrong, but so I think at some point you said something like, so we form moral concepts from entering into causal contact with moral properties or something along those lines. But then I was wondering which sort of causal notion do you think is like operating there? Like, so you talk about like some pluralism about properties, like you're willing to like, different sort of properties. Would that entail some sort of like pluralism about causation? Maybe the sort of causal relation that like is operating there is different from the one you find in the natural world. So that I'm objecting that just
Catherine. I think there is I think there are causal laws beyond the causal laws, if there are any, that you find in physics. We know there aren't in physics, but I'm not just applying to the moral realm. I think that's true in psychology. I think it's true in biology. I think there are certain causal laws and properties that are linked by causal relations that can't be reduced to physics, and so adding the moral properties in might bring some extra worries, but the pluralism I'm quite happy with. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about how easy or difficult it is to get externalism to kind of make room for the position you want. So the way that the thought experiments supporting content externalism seem to go is that you get some examples of someone who has an incomplete grasp of a concept, but still seems able to grasp relevant propositions or think about the relevance property. And at least Burge's conclusion seems to be this will work for a lot of concepts at least. So maybe for most concepts, there's some part of the concept, so to speak, that the subject can be missing and still have thoughts involving the relevant concept. But that doesn't entail that for any part of the concept, the subject can be missing that part of the concept and still have the relevant thought. So someone might say, well, moral concepts, the part that people like Alice are missing is this crucial part which you can't be missing while still grasping the relevant thought. I'm not sure if I would like this view, but it seems like something someone could try to push. So I was wondering how you thought about the arguments for externalism and whether you see them as more straightforwardly implying that any part could be missing for the concept, and the concept still be available for the subject.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's two aspects to that question. One is whether I think any aspect of the concept can be missing and you still possess it. Mm-hmm. And the other is, even if I don't agree with that, do I think that affects the argument concerning moral concepts? So the second part seems to tie into the question about evaluative property. So, is maybe the evaluative bit the bit that you can't have?
Right, yeah.
I mean, of course, if someone gave me an argument against that, I would have to deal with it, but I don't at the moment see why I should accept that the evaluative part is the part that you can't be missing and yet still have the concept. In the more general question, the first question, I don't see why not, actually. I don't see why you can't take any particular part of the concept out. I mean, you might get some strange cases, and obviously if you take, one of the things that makes the Alice case quite plausible, I think, is that there's a lack of motivation, but it's not as if her concept is radically different in lots of ways from everybody else's. There's a whole set of concepts surrounding it that do a lot of the work. And so a lot of her beliefs involving the concept are exactly the same beliefs that we have. And I think so that sort of bolsters it a lot. So you don't get a sort of really minimal case, like what was Burgess' example, thinking of orangutans with fruit juice or something. Yeah, so it's not like that. There's a whole set of true beliefs and accurate beliefs and reflective beliefs that we have in common with Alice. And yet still it looks as if it's a motivation because of the economic.
So I had two questions. One was just really that I don't understand the sense in which you can think of moral concepts as representational, and I was wondering if you could say something about that. And then the other was, so is it fair to state the motivational internalist's position as something like, if you hold a moral judgment, if you make a moral judgment, then of a sort of conceptual necessity, you feel you should act on that, on the basis of that judgment?
If I say yes, is there another question?
Yeah. I was just wondering if that was the right way to put it, because if that's the way to put it, then it seems that when you're dealing with the objections they raise, one of your objections might be a little bit kind of unfair against them. So one of the objections they raise is Alice's judgments about fairness and unfairness cease to be moral judgments after she develops her moral theory. And you say, well, that can't be because she still makes these moral judgments. But it seems like if that conditional, I said before, was their position, then it's part of their position that they no longer hold moral judgments if they cease to act on them. Do you see what I mean? So it's not...
I think that's right, but I think what I was trying to do there was look at the case not from... but just look at the case sort of intuitively. Right? I mean, it doesn't... I mean, it's a pretty dramatic claim to say that just because she's got a different moral theory, she suddenly loses the... I mean, if that's what the internalist is committed to, then, it just looks implausible, I think.
It's sort of... it comes down to an intuition war, though, at that stage, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Alice has only a partial grasp of the concept of fairness, right, but presumably, lots of ordinary people have an incomplete grasp of the concept of fairness. I expect I do, and yet those people are motivated to promote fairness, etc. Externalist motivational internalism doesn't tell us anything about why those ordinary folk with the partial understanding are motivated. And I just wondered, what's your story about why they get motivated?
Yeah, that's right, and that relates to your question, I think. So I think there are different parts of the overall project. So you're right that I haven't given an account here of what motivates people with a partial grasp of the concept. And that is something I'll need to think about more. All I was trying to do here, in a way, was say there's a way in which you can preserve the internal connection between between judgment and motivation, and yet allow that there be certain kinds of amoralists.
Right.
So yes, I mean it's very complicated. I haven't said anything about that, and I do need to think about it.
Right. And so if I came along and suggested that the ordinary folk are only motivated, given their partial understanding, because of an extra desire that they have, you wouldn't actually reject that, at least at this point in your...
I would want to reject it, but I don't have an argument against it at the moment, yes,
right,
but I would want to reject it.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, so I just had a couple of small questions to think about ERI. So one's just terminological about the label, so it's why it counts as a version of internalism at all. So I get why EMI is a version of motivational judgment internally, because certain kinds of moral judgment, it is still kind of intrinsically motivated. But given that reasons internalism was supposed to be the view that subjective reasons for actions necessarily derive from the subjective motivational set, given you reject that, it just seems like it's not actually a version of internalism at all.
That's right. So that does tie into my claim at the end, but it's actually a version of externalism at root. It just goes some way towards accommodating internalist intuitions. Because I take it with the externalist position, what you need is an explanation of how objective facts can be motivating. And so this is a way of bringing the objective facts inside you, because the content of the objective facts form the content of your judgments, and given EMI, that they will then motivate you to act. So you're right, it's leaning on the externalist side, but it's a way of answering that.
Okay, just sort of thought like that. Well, it was almost misleading, but that's all. No big deal with it, obviously. But then about actually it's not the wording of it. So I'm puzzled why you sort of put it in the form of a conditional you do, because it seems that so you say if ER says necessarily if an individual makes a sincere moral judgment, she has a full grasp of the concepts involved in that moral judgment, and the content of a moral judgment will state an external, objective, normative reasons why. It seems like on your view, I'm not saying that's not going to be true, I'm just saying that any moral judgment at all is going to be such that the content of that moral judgment states an external, objective, normative reasons why. Because the whole kind of point about externalism is that even as your sort of grasp on the concept varies, the content just remains the same. So I can't see sort of the relevance of the antecedent. So put it, it's just, it's going to be true, but no matter what, every moral judgment is going to have that content.
So every moral judgment will state an external, objective, normative reason to act.
Yeah.
I think that what that just shows is that I just need to revise the conditionals because it doesn't quite capture what I wanted. But I don't. So I said more than that in the explanation of the paper.
Yeah, sure.
It's not that big. No, that's fine. I should probably just revise the conditionals. Maybe I'll take account all the objections.
Nick. I was wondering about the connection between the content externalism and the objectivity of moral properties. I guess I was thinking that the content externalism tells you that the content of your thoughts and the contents of your judgments depend on your environment, but they might depend on non-objective features of the environment. And if moral properties were like that, then it looks like at first class you'd have a way of combining the content externalism with non-objectivity.
That may be true. I mean, in a way, there's sort of additional motivation for me in the background that wasn't stated here. And I have very, very strong moral realist intuitions, and so that's maybe playing a part. But I'll have to think about that.
I was wondering if you thought anyone fully grasped any concept.
I think it is possible to. I think it may be impossible to know that you can. Which brings me worry.
So it's possible that no one actually now fully grasps any concept.
It's possible.
Okay, so this is a follow-up to a point that people have made about partial grasp of a concept and the fact that this seems to be disanalogous to the sort of Putnam-Burge cases and deference to experts. So I think there is a case that's very closely analogous. But if you examine our intuitions about it, I'm not sure that they go in the way that would support your thesis. And it's partial grasp of a logical constant. Because we there's some pressure to think that grasp of a logical concept is in some way motivating. And if you grasp a conditional, you should be disposed to reason in accordance with modus ponens and modus tollens. So think about, let's just assume that S5 is the true logic of metaphysical modality. So someone who fully grasps the concept of metaphysical modality in your sense would know that. But nonetheless, there are plenty of cases of partial grasp in which someone, say, wouldn't accept the 5 axiom or wouldn't know, and we would still say that they have a partial grasp of the concept of metaphysical modality. But now think about something analogous to the Bob case. I'll follow the Alice case. Sorry, I'll follow the practice of cryptographers and call the next one after Alice Bob. So say that Bob knows will write down and will affirm all of the constitutive axioms and rules of S5, but is not disposed to revise his beliefs in any way according to that. That it's, if he finds himself believing that it's not necessary that he has no disposition to infer to it's necessary that it's not necessary that he. In that case, it seems to me very odd to call that a partial grasp of the concept in the same way that we would say that someone who just denied one of the axioms of the true theory that a being that had a full grasp would have. It doesn't seem the same thing as the way we would call that a partial grasp of the concept.
It does seem as if there's something different going on in the two cases. It's not clear to me why you can't call both of them cases which involve partial grasp of the concept. So in the first case, it does look as if, someone understands the axioms but just rejects one of them, right? So they're wrong to do this because S5 is clearly the just true. So that is the partial grasp, that's fine. In the second case, are we supposed to imagine someone who not only writes down the axioms but asserts them, so this is clearly the true logic, this is what we should do, but doesn't actually...
Yeah, but has no motivation to reason in accordance.
It's an odd case. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what to say about that, but I do think that grasping a concept is connected not only to a disposition to make true utterances that express thoughts involved in that concept, but also to the disposition to act in certain ways and revise beliefs in certain ways. And so it does look to me as if it's a partial grasp of the concept that just comes out in a different way.
If you want to stick to the parallelism.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm wondering what role, if any, there could be for the distinction between thin and thick moral concepts in the case of the amoralist and Alex. So a lot of the intuitions in favour of the kind of internalist conceptual relationship as being judgments and motivations all involve thin concepts. They were all that it seems very strange for someone to think that an action is right but not be motivated to do it. But in the case of Alex, where it seems like a plausible example of someone who has these judgments but not motivations, it's a thick concept of fairness. And precisely what goes wrong in that case is that she has false beliefs about the relationship between that thick concept and a thin concept. She has false beliefs about the relationship between fairness and rightness or goodness. So I'm wondering if there is a coherent position for the internalists to say that what matters is the connection between moral judgments involving thin concepts and motivation. So that one yeah, given a moral judgment in concept, so then we have necessarily have motivation.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I use the terms thin moral concept and thick moral concept just because they're in the literature. I mean, it's not actually clear to me that there's a clear divide between the two. I think it's much more hazy than that. But I suppose there might be a position separating that. Yeah.
Just abuse chair's privilege and ask a question about the non-humanism. So I guess this is connected with some other questions, but I guess it looks as though you ought to be committed to there being an aspect of grasp of the moral concepts which all in its own fixes that one who grasps that aspect will be motivated in making judgments with the concept. So at that point you look to be committed to a form of strong rejection of externalism.
What kind of externalism?
Externalism that was motivational, say that you couldn't grasp that aspect of the concept without thereby being motivated. So I was just interested in whether you have views about that.
Sorry, can you say that again?
So there have to be features, it seems, there have to be features of your grasp of moral concepts such that by grasping those and making judgments in accord with that grasp, one's thereby motivated. So with respect to those aspects of your grasp of the concept, externalism is impossible. One can't grasp those elements without thereby being motivated.
Okay, it's not clear to me I want to accept the claim that there are features of concepts that you have to grasp. So that's the bit I want to resist.
Just one last point. Okay, acquiring the concept in your brain is a matter of being acquainted with the moral reality. Yes. The moral concept, and the moral reality is moral because it is evaluative. Okay, we call it morality has some evaluative aspect. Then it seems that this person, in order to grasp the concept, must be acquainted with this moral reality. So it couldn't be that he fails to have the evaluative part. If he's supposed to have the concept, the moral concept, and he acquired through this moral reality, he must have. No, at least otherwise he wouldn't have the moral concept, he would have something else. But no. I don't know if I just clearly know.
I'll need to think about that more, but obviously I want to resist it.
Okay, so it's time for a break now. So before breaking, we should thank Sarah very much for an excellent talk and discussion.